Hello and welcome back to lesson number 26 in junior English. Um, I hope you all had a great break. I hope you had a safe break and got to see people even if you couldn't be with people this year. Um, and thanks for observing this lesson. Sorry I'm going to be out on Monday. I will be back on Thursday. And as always, if you have any questions, you can always comment on this video in Google Classroom or on any of the assignments in Google Classroom as well, and I will be able to get back to you there. Um, Today we're going to have this week is mostly focused on the rough draft for your second essay, which is due on Saturday. We're finishing up that second essay this month. In the next 2 weeks that we have, our primary goal is going to be that essay. We're also going to have an introduction to A Raisin of the Sun, which is our next primary text following The Great Gatsby. So for this week, the only assignment, the only graded assignment, and the only assignment, no other extra credit this week, is the rough draft, which is due on Saturday. So all of our focus is going to be on completing that rough draft when it comes to work that is graded in this class. Real quick, let's take a look at our learning targets for the first half of this week. Our writing lesson, we're going to practice embedding quotations in our writing so that we have multiple avenues to include quotes in our second A2C essay. And this means you're going to be able to quote a source in multiple ways in an academic essay. We're going to both look at examples of how to do that. We're going to look at steps to do that as you're incorporating quotes from your interviews into this essay. In our 15-minute literature mini lesson, we're going to explore our next primary text through a short background video and a short kind of walkthrough of the context of Lorraine Hansberry to understand why we're reading A Raisin in the Sun, what it's about, and why it still matters. And then we're going to have a short informational lesson. We're going to look at an example essay for the second A2C essay as a group. And that means we're going to be able to recognize what a high-scoring essay looks like and kind of understand what the rubric expectations are as we go into writing our rough draft. The week structure is as usual, a Monday, Tuesday lesson. Again, I'll be out Monday, sorry about that, but I will be in on Wednesday and Thursday this week. If you need live assistance, I will also be there on Tuesday and Friday. For mindfulness, I actually have a mindfulness video for you today. All right, I'm gonna try and find some videos from. I used to do a video every day, just that has nothing to do with English, but is interesting in something that I called the argument for Earth. And I'm gonna try to incorporate some more argument for Earth videos into these lessons that are actual legit mindfulness instead of just here's a GIF. Let's move on. Okay, so today our writing lesson is going to be practicing embedding quotations in our writing so that we have a couple different ways to do that. And I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step process to embed the quotations that you got when you did your interviews. Okay, so the first step is to introduce the author of the quotation. So you're using someone else's words, so you need to do this to avoid claims of plagiarism. So the first time you introduce an author, you'll use their name and you'll actually directly introduce them, and then after that, you can just use their last name. So to try to avoid being stuck saying things like he says or she says continuously, you can use a variety of verbs like they stated, they declared, they believe, they contend, they recall, they write, they noted, they critique, they proposed. That kind of they think this. Using just different verbs than say is a good way to vary your sentence structure a little bit. So in the example we're going to look at the end of this lesson, in the informational part of this lesson, when we read together, we're going to read this one together. So at the beginning of the essay that we're going to use as an example later, the student says, uses the quote. They start with the quote, "I remember walking to my first clinic. I was so nervous that my hand shook on the door handle," said Avis Marshall when I asked her about how she started her career as a medical transcriptionist. That's not the greatest sentence to read out loud with said when putting the quote first. It is an interesting way to start the essay because we have that nervous hand shaking on the door handle. We're kind of rooted in the physicality of the person they're interviewing. So but you can see in the green we have said Avis Marshall. It's deadly important that you include the name of the person that you're interviewing or the name of the person that you're quoting in some way, so that you avoid the label of plagiarism. So here's an example for a first-time quotation from a walkthrough I found online. They use Marx and the Communist Manifesto a bunch, which is kind of goofy, but that's what they use. So they say, Karl Marx, writer of the pamphlet The Communist Manifesto, proclaims, communism abolishes all eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality, something of constituting them on a new basis. So the blue is the quote, and we introduce good old Karl Marx in the green. So we're introducing the person before the quote. Another example for a later quotation, after you've introduced them, you could just say Marx contends or Marx says communism abolishes all eternal truths. So like you can start the first time you introduce someone in your essay, you need to use their entire name. The second time you're referring to them in a quote, you can just use their last name and be perfectly fine. And that 81 you see there, that's the page number that they're getting that from. Because you're not quoting from a book, you won't need to have a page number. So you don't need to worry about page numbers. You just need to have their name for this essay. All right, so the second step is including the quote. So when you're choosing which quotes to include, you should try to pick quotes that add to your argument or support your argument in some way. So if you look at the outline assignment and the explanation of the outline assignment that we did in class, you'll get some good examples of how to find a quote that matches your support. Really, you shouldn't be writing your essay until after you have those quotes. This is an extremely difficult essay to write if you get the quotes after you do your outline, because you're trying to fit quotes to your statements. It's much better to get the quotes in the interview using the questions that you put together and then write an outline using those quotes. So kind of just more on this page, you should only really use a quote that's more than 3 sentences long if you think it's impossible to eliminate some of it and still retain the quality. So like a 4-sentence quote says to your reader, this is important that you get it exactly the way I got it. And to the degree that I can't summarize it, you need to hear it in their words. So when you quote a long passage, you're actually going to begin the quote on the next line of text and indent the entire thing, and you're not going to use quotation marks around it. So that's a lot of just text. I'm going to show you what that looks like. So here is Later on when you quote someone, you don't need to use their name. You could just put their name after the quote in the parentheses, like you see here. You could just say their name. Now you won't need to have the page number again. So let's take a look at a block quote. I think I have block quotes after this. Okay, so we'll talk about block quotes in a second. First, let's talk about a couple different ways to quote. So the first method of quoting is when you emphasize your quote first. So with the example I showed you just a second ago from that student essay on the world of a medical transcriptionist, they open with the quote, and my quotes are in blue here. They open with the quote, and then they introduce the person. And when you do that, you're emphasizing your quote. So if you open with the quote, you're emphasizing this good quote you got. So if you have a really great quote, you might open with it like that. The second method emphasizes the context of the quote. So like the stuff happening around the quote, or the interview itself, or some other fact that you want to share. So if you take that same sentence and flip it, and instead of having the when I asked her about how she started her career as a medical transcriptionist at the end, if you put that at the beginning, when I asked her about how she started her career as a medical transcriptionist, Avis Marshall said, I'm still giving you the name, I remember walking to my first clinic. I was so nervous that my hand shook on the door handle. So just by flipping that sentence around a little bit, we're now emphasizing the interview, and we're not emphasizing the quote. It's still a great quote, but because I started with the ask and then introduced her and then went into the quote, this sentence is now more about the interview than the quote. That's just kind of it's the same sentence. We're just moving things around for emphasis. This is the kind of thinking that you do as an editor when you're doing like legit editing. And then there's the last method, which is for after you've already introduced the speaker, and it helps vary your sentence structure. So this is if this were to come later on in the essay after we've already introduced the person that we're interviewing. And this is what that sounds like. It's the same sentence, but just shifted a little bit. When I asked her about how she started her career as a medical transcriptionist, she said, I remember walking into my first clinic. I was so nervous that my hand shook on the door handle. And then I put Marshall in parentheses, because that's the name of the person we're interviewing. You always need to have the person who you're quoting somewhere. And if you don't have their name in the sentence, put it at the end of the sentence in parentheses. That way, you can't be accused of plagiarism because you're quoting. Okay, so this is what a block quote looks like. If a quote is more than 4 sentences long, it morphs into this block quote thing. So to produce a block quote, you need to do a couple things. So the first thing you do is you need to provide an introduction for the quotation. And what that looks like is basically where you introduce the quote similar to in the last examples where they said, in my interview, I asked the person this and they said, and their response was. So their introduction is, sometimes people's viewpoints can be rather surprising, as mentioned in the book, The Call of Stories. So I know that I'm about to get, as a reader, I know that I'm about to get a surprising viewpoint. And that's going to be what this quote is about. So you're introducing the quote a little bit ahead of it. So if there's a four sentence quote, you need that little introduction. Then you need to skip to a new line. So the quote begins on a new line. So hit enter and then hit tab to indent each line by 1/2 inch. So you do not need quotation marks for a block quote, which is kind of cool. They're special. They are now in they are quote. They are clearly a quote because they're set apart, and they have that indentation where they're set off from the side. And you also don't need a period after the parentheses on this one. They're just kind of weird. They're just kind of wacky. They're a little bit different. I would recommend, if you haven't done block quotes before, Googling block quote MLA. Google block quote MLA if you're trying to do one and incorporate a quote that's more than 4 sentences long, or just put a quote that's more than 4 sentences long in your rough draft, and I'll help you by giving you a little bit of direction in how to correctly format that. Also worth noting, your name is still in there. You're still telling exactly who you're quoting. It just comes after the period, which is, again, kind of a wacky thing that block quotes do. They don't look like other quotes in MLA because you're saying these words need to be seen exactly how I saw them in the original text because they're written better than I could paraphrase them. Okay, so the third step to incorporating a good quote is summarizing it. So you've introduced your person that you're quoting, you've plopped the quote in there that you really like, and now you need to summarize. So you're going to rephrase the quotation in your own words. Does this feel extra? Yes. Is it extra? Kind of. Mostly what you're doing here is you're showing the reader that you're giving the reader another opportunity to understand the quote before you analyze it. So like if you just like drop like the cleanest, best description of something that you need a quote for in your research paper, it is the absolute spot on description, but your reader doesn't quite get it, and then you go straight into analysis, you have lost your reader. And not only have you lost your reader, but if you're analyzing it poorly yourself, that summary is going to give you another opportunity to like really um, uh, zero in on your understanding of what the quote is. Here's an example. Okay, I didn't have an example for that one, but I'll give you an example in class. So basically, to kind of continue talking about what I was just talking about, you drop the quote in, and then you provide a summary of the quote. So you're just in your own words paraphrasing and rephrasing that quote. So the fourth step is analyzing the quotation, which is different. So when you're summarizing, you're retelling the quotation in different words and giving your reader another opportunity to understand it before you move on to analysis. When you're doing analysis, you're breaking it down and examining its parts to kind of blow it up for your reader and work it into your argument. So to do this, you should be identifying keywords or phrases that help explain the significance of the quotation. And you can use those keywords to uncover its meaning and incorporate it into your argument. So you can italicize or quote those words in your analytical sentence. You should be providing your own commentary on its meaning. You're not just rephrasing it anymore. Now you're giving your opinions on what that quote was. And then the last step is stating its relevance to your argument. This is the most important step because it ties it back to the rest of your paper. So after your analysis, I really think that they were saying this in that quote. After your analysis, you say, and when I say that they were saying that the person I'm quoting believes X, this is why it fits into my essay. So you can do this in a lot of different ways. So drawing a parallel between the quote and your argument, it's clear to see that this person believes the same thing as me, or it's clear to see that this person believes the opposite of what I'm saying, and here's why I'm right. Stating its relevance completes the argument and shows the reader that you've completed your thought. You shouldn't end a paragraph with a quote without explaining its significance to your argument. So if you're dropping a quote at the end of your paragraph, it's really bad form. It's weak research writing. You shouldn't end with a quote. There are of course, some very strange circumstances in which that wouldn't be true. Potentially at a conclusion of an essay, after you spent a lot of time working up to it, but for the most part, you shouldn't be ending paragraphs with quotes. All right, so for example, this is Marx's call for the abolishment of all truths requires too much change in people's lives. His ideas are not ideal to change society. So the full integration of that quote, to kind of walk through the steps that I saw on this example was the first step, Karl Marx, writer of the pamphlet The Communist Manifesto proclaims. All right, we've introduced him. Step 2. Communism abolishes all eternal truths instead of constituting them on a new basis. Marx 81. That's our quote. And I have that nice little Marx 81 at the end to show that that's where I got it from. In other words, communism throws out all beliefs, not only the ones that counter the ideas of communism. Step 3 is summary. I'm just saying the same thing, maybe a little bit more clearly, though we are talking about straight up political theory. So it's a little bit dense still. And then step 4 is analysis. Marx's insistence on abolishment reflects the greater implication that communism not only represents a change in a political system or belief, but also negates all previously accepted aspects of life. This would require a radical change of heart for all people. So that's their analysis based on the quote of communism abolishes all eternal truths. And then the final step, where they incorporate it back into their essay, they say, Marx's call for the abolishment of truths requires too much change in people's lives. His ideas are not ideal to change society. Boom, Marx destroyed. So the fifth step is where they incorporate it back into their essay. I assume their essay is some kind of Marxist critique or anti-Marxist critique about like the problems with the Communist Manifesto. Okay, that was dense. That was quick. If you need more help on this, we're going to be hitting rough draft writing on Thursday and Friday also. We're going to look a little bit differently at it. We're going to look at making sure that we're writing in the academic tone and staying out of first person and second person as much as possible. So again, the only graded assignment this week is your rough draft, which is due this Saturday. It is 5 paragraphs long. It has an intro, 3 support paragraphs, and a conclusion. The goal of this one is 2 pages. So hopefully your quotes help you get a little bit closer to that 2-page limit without a ton of more writing than the first essay. All right, so now we're going to explore our next primary text through a short background video and a little bit of context. This means we're going to be able to explain the historical context of A Raisin in the Sun. So after this walkthrough, you're going to be able to tell people why we're reading this book or play, or rather why we're watching and reading this play. So this is from a student project on A Raisin in the Sun that has a ton of really good quotes and sources. So on the surface, A Raisin in the Sun is about an African-American family's struggle to get out of the ghetto on Chicago's South Side. However, Hansberry utilizes numerous themes and complex characters that require multiple levels of analysis beyond the primary issues that drive the plot. The beauty of the play is that it explores the African-American identity, social status, and racial challenges in conjunction with the intricacies of universal human nature. Throughout Hansberry's brief life, she only lived to be in her 30s, she took every chance to be revolutionary, not only in her actions in everyday life, but also through her literary works. The fact that she could tell painful truths to a society unaccustomed to rigorous self-criticism and still receive its praise is a testimony to her skill both as a writer and a student of life. And that's Lorraine Hansberry, the writer. In many ways, her early life contributed to the manifestation of her first work. Although she was born into middle-class comfort on the south side of Chicago, Hansberry witnessed the injustices plaguing American society firsthand. Despite her family's material comfort, they were still restricted to the black ghettos, so Lorraine grew up alongside a number of lower-class friends and neighbors who taught her about their harsh reality. Surprisingly, her privilege still did not insulate her from the struggles and anger of racial minorities in the lower classes. At one point, her father waged a legal battle that reached the Supreme Court, Hansberry versus Lee, that dealt with their right to purchase a home in a previously all-white neighborhood, which is a theme and one of the main plot points in A Raisin in the Sun. The battle was won, but the war was far from over as Hansberry's family was subjected to vicious physical attacks once they moved in. Although her work is not autobiographical, it is undeniable that hints of her childhood surface throughout her writing and influence her thoughts and beliefs. So that's the paper from when the decision went through, and they successfully won the right to move into an all-white neighborhood. Raisin in the Sun was initially relegated to the outdated category of autobiography because it emerged prior to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. However, this view neglects to acknowledge the insights and warnings regarding the cataclysmic results of civil unrest and inequality inherent in Raisin in the Sun. Also, prior to the manuscript's completion in 1957, a number of important events occurred that undoubtedly affected Hansberry's writing. Among others, the Supreme Court ruled against local covenants that perpetuated segregated neighborhoods in 1949. We talked about that a little bit before we went to break in the redlining mini lesson. And determined in 1954's Brown v. Board of Education that separate but equal school segregation is unconstitutional. This is a picture from Brown v. Board of Education's ruling, and you have a bunch of white folks there holding race mixing is communism signs. If you're wondering whether or not calling things that you hate communist was new, it is not. In many ways, Hansberry anticipated the need and called for minority empowerment against inequality and discrimination. One of her major thematic criticisms was the gap between the American dream and the Black American reality, which is very much what we've been talking about with James Baldwin and Buckley and, Lies My Teacher Told Me, and a little bit of color and law as we go forward. The ability to have a dream and the chance to fulfill it was, and unfortunately still is, different depending on social status and racial makeup. The younger family, which is the family in the play, is portrayed in such a proud and honorable light to emphasize the injustice and to call for policy and societal changes. Hansberry is largely responsible for redefining the term universality in art, especially in American art. For a long time, the term was monadic in its conception and application. Monadic just means there was one application, and it was white. It had been developed and applied to mean whiteness rather than including the diversity of modern-day society. And universality is this idea that art can speak to something that is true for all people at all times. And that's a challenging concept, and there's this ongoing debate of whether art is universal or art can be universal, or whether art depends heavily and is heavily reliant on culture. Here I have two examples of what I think is universality in art. At the top you have La Pieta by Michelangelo, and at the bottom you have Miles Morales, over his uncle Aaron, and both of, the moment of loss in both of these images. One is of course Michelangelo like being awesome and carving stone, and the other of course is Into the Spider-Verse, which is arguably a amazing, also a huge piece of art and a perfect representation of the animated film as an art form. It's basically peak animation, and both of those are working through the emotions of loss, and it's a universal emotion. Another contributing factor to the inaccurate conceptualization of the term was that black art continued to separate itself from the mainstream by isolating discussions of social problems from racial issues. Instead, Hansberry sought to concurrently consider social significance and racial consciousness. So she wanted to write about social significance, meaning like wealth inequality, and racial consciousness, meaning black identity. And the struggle between the struggles of colorism, and am I black enough? Am I not black enough? Who's white enough to pass? Who's black enough to pass? And assimilationism, which is a huge, is it right to let go of your culture and assimilate into quote unquote American culture or white American culture? Is it a good or a negative or a bad thing to do that? What do you lose? What do you gain? Her attention to details opened the door for white audiences into an understanding of black experiences that made those experiences understandable and relevant. And we're going to talk so much about colorism and assimilationism as we go on, and it's fascinating and it's ongoing. In the words of James Baldwin, the play received such acclaim from the African American community because never before in American theater history has so much of the truth of black people's lives been seen on stage. The inclusion of the black experience within the framework of the human experience forced a redefinition that opened the term universality to include the minority voice in America. This change may often go unnoted, but is an important illustration of one way Hansberry unintentionally changed the landscape of society through art. In fact, Hansberry herself believes the question is not whether one will make a social statement in one's work, but what the statement will say. So she's saying all art makes a statement. Some are simply more controversial than others, or some are simply, good or bad, but all art says something. The cruel reality and irony of the play is that despite the realization of the family's dream to move to the new house, the newspaper stories of black homes being bombed, the attacks upon black families mentioned by Mrs. Johnson, and the crudeness of the new neighborhood's welcoming committee promises that their struggles are far from over. Herein lies the mastery of Hansberry's work. She's able to deal with issues of racism and discrimination while maintaining a thoughtful story about a family, race aside, struggling against poverty. Although initially under-recognized as a timeless work, historical context reveals Raisin's significance as a lasting literary social criticism. So the student author of that review was talking about how important the play that we're about to read is, not only as an African American story, not only as a black narrative, but also as a social narrative in the United States. So when we talk about the American Dream and the Great Gatsby, we're not just talking about money, but we're also talking about the very specific way that money and race in the history of the United States have gate kept the American dream. And in A Raisin in the Sun, we're going to be talking about how money, race, and physical gatekeeping, as in literally gated communities, have kept people from achieving the American dream. Here's a 2-minute intro to Lorraine Hansberry, and then we're going to continue on. So, so there is a great documentary on PBS called Sighted Eyes Feeling Heart. If you want to check out more about Lorraine Hansberry, it's an hour and a half long. Highly recommend it. If you knock out your draft and if you are kind of walking through this year and you're like, oh, that's another kind of interesting thing about American history that I have not yet delved into. And if you're digging the focus of this, these units, you might check that out. Again, it's called Sighted Eyes Feeling Hearts. Kind of a kitschy title, but it's a really good documentary on Lorraine Hansberry. So that's the end of our literature lesson. So for this informational lesson, we're going to read an example essay for the second essay as a group, and we're going to look at what a high-scoring essay on the rubric looks like so we can understand the rubric expectations just a little bit better. Again, this is our rubric. It is linked on the top of your rough draft assignment. If you want to take a look at it while you're writing your rough draft, we're going to try and stay in that 3 to 4 range. Again, if you're turning in a rough draft, you're making it a lot easier for yourself to get a 3 or a 4 on language and conventions. You're making it much easier on yourself to earn that 3 or 4 in language and conventions. And if you did an outline, then you made it much easier on yourself to earn a 3 or 4 on purpose and focus, idea development, and structure. So the outline makes this all of these much easier to earn, and the rough draft makes this much easier to earn. Without the outline or the rough draft, you're in danger of those 1s and 2s. All right, so let's take a look at this example essay provided by the A2C group. So this essay is from 2019, it's from last year, and it's on the world of a medical transcriptionist. So already we have good structure, right? We have the student is using indentation. They've correctly formatted their intro up top, and they have double spaced their essay. And they even have a title that is center aligned. You don't have to have a center aligned title other than essay number 2, but if you want to do a fancy center aligned title, that's cool. So let's keep looking at structure for a second because it's easy to see. When we're looking at structure, we're also looking at, are the sentences multiple different kinds of sentence structures. So let's look at this one here. I remember walking into my first clinic. I was so nervous that my hand shook at the door handle, comma, said Avis Marshall when I asked her about how she started her career as a medical transcriptionist. While many people might know how it feels to be nervous on their first day at a job, comma, most people have no idea what working as a medical transcriptionist involved. A medical transcriptionist transcribes in medical terms what a doctor or clinician is dictating after a patient visit, surgery, test result, etc. So we have a short list here at the end of the sentence. The medical language has a form all its own, comma, complete with synonyms, comma, antonyms, and all the rules of the English language. It is the medical transcriptionist's job to correctly and perfectly document this information while understanding mispronunciations and accents, comma, and Avis Marshall has been a transcriptionist for 32 years. So we already have a couple different types of sentence structure. That's solid. This is looking like a very well structured paragraph so far. So let's go back and look at purpose and focus. So let's look at purpose and focus for a second. So when we're looking at purpose and focus, we're looking at the reason for this essay to exist. This is going to be an essay about the world of a medical transcriptionist. Are they talking about the world of a medical transcriptionist? So how she started her career as a medical transcriptionist. While many people know how it feels to be nervous on their first day at a job, most people have no idea what working as a medical transcriptionist involves. So we're still talking about our topic. A medical transcriptionist transcribes in medical terms what a doctor or clinician is dictating. So we're describing. The medical language has a form all its own, complete with synonyms, antonyms, and all the rules of the English language. The medical language is directly related to our topic. It is the medical transcriptionist's job to correctly, and now we're still explaining what their job is. Her experience shows how much the work of a medical transcriptionist has changed over the years. We're very much staying laser focused on target to the point where I think she could have maybe said the phrase medical transcriptionist less, but this is still a very strong purpose and focus. Cool. So let's look at idea development. This is the first paragraph, so there's not a ton of idea development that can happen here. But what she could be doing in her first paragraph is setting up a structure for later on. So what do we have here? While many people might know how it feels to be nervous on their first day at a job, most people have no idea what working as a medical transcriptionist involves. Here, let's take a second and get rid of all this ink. Let's just focus on idea development. So people might not know how it feels to be nervous on the first day of a job. And they might have no idea what working as a medical transcriptionist involves. So we have this idea that people need to learn about what is involved in doing this job. So the rest of this is going to be focused on that idea of what that job is. They transcribe, they dictate, they have to know the medical language, they have to correctly and perfectly document this information. Her experience shows how much the work has changed. So this is all tied to this idea about what the work involves. So as it stands, this is a 3 or a 4 right now. This is a really strong opening. The only thing that I would potentially take off for is, it's probably honestly a 4 across the board, but that first sentence is just a little bit wonky when you read it out loud. Great start to an essay. All right, so this is support paragraph number 1. So let's see how much they stick with our purpose and focus, our idea development, if there are any weird outstanding structure or language and conventions issues. Actually, here we'll just do language and conventions in red. Okay, so before becoming a medical transcriptionist, Marshall had a civil service job that entailed talking to the public 8 hours a day. So one thing I immediately notice, when you write numbers, you should write them out if they're under 10, so you should type out 8. She talked to people of all cultures and economic levels. It was a high-stress, fast-paced job. She left this job to take on medical transcription job closer to home. Just kind of, we're still talking about her medical transcription job. The job was at a clinic near a major city. The women in her office enjoyed chatting before they worked. They would interact with patients and doctors, all the while receiving a vast medical education absolutely free of charge. As technology improved, they became more and more efficient. So just a couple things that jump out to me immediately. These sentences, these two sentences here, are pretty basic when it comes to structure. The job was at a clinic. The women in her office enjoyed chatting. Those are some pretty basic sentences. But then because they're followed by these more complex sentences, that's sentence variation, and that bumps the structure up to a 3 or a 4. So that's some good sentence variation there. The lengths are different. The use of commas and complexity is different. So that's good. Also, when we look at idea development, are we developing the idea of what it takes to do those jobs? Yeah, so are we still talking about what it takes to do those jobs? Their interactions with patients and doctors. Receiving a vast medical education absolutely free of charge. Those are actions that they took. As technology improved, they became more efficient, so they're using technology. We also get a little bit of her talking about this civil service job. That's kind of a danger here. Like if she'd have spent a lot of time talking about that civil service job and not just 2 sentences, she could have run off the rails a little bit and lost her focus. But I think that it's useful to have the context before becoming a medical transcriptionist. We're still talking about her work as a medical transcriptionist. We're still focused on our purpose as we're developing this idea. So there's idea development here. We're still focused, laser focused on this purpose of writing about her work as a medical transcriptionist. We're giving some background, giving more examples, like the job was at a clinic near a major city, giving some details. The women in her office enjoyed chatting before they worked. That's some strong idea development there too. And structurally, I just don't see a lot of issues here. The only language and convention thing that popped out in support paragraph 1 was that 8 from 8 hours a day should be written out as EIGHT instead of as just the number. Anything under 10 you should write out. It's just kind of the rule. Solid though. We're still looking at a 4 kind of across the board. So support paragraph 2. We're going to be looking again at purpose and focus, idea development, structure, and language and conventions. So let's kind of read through with those lenses attached. The medical world is also changing and improving, implementing new laws regarding medical privacy and responsibility. This brought about numerous changes to the profession. The changes for Marshall as a transcriptionist involved being responsible for correcting doctors' mistakes, mishaps, diction, sentence structure, medications, and measurements. In short, she and other transcriptionists were responsible for producing absolutely correct documentation of what the doctor was dictating. We are still laser focused on her transcriptionist job. We're talking about what the job requires. We're talking about the world of a medical transcriptionist. So that's some solid focus on purpose and focus. If they could not find the correct information, they had to know where to find the correct references. They were transcribing legal documents, putting their names on them, and claiming the responsibility. So when we're talking about idea development, we're developing the idea of what the work is. So we're going to be talking about those numerous changes, because this paragraph is about the changing medical world. So this paragraph starts with a sentence about how the medical world is changing and improving. That's going to be the focus for the rest of this paragraph as we support the original focus of her job as a transcription. So what are those changes? They're now responsible for correcting doctors, this list of things. And they became responsible for producing absolutely correct documentation. If they couldn't find it, they had to know where to find the correct references, and they're transcribing legal documents and claiming responsibility. So this is all because of these new laws regarding medical privacy and responsibility. So as the laws changed, they gained all these new responsibilities. So we, in this first sentence, introduced that things are changing because of new laws and regulations, and it changed their responsibilities. And then we gave a whole bunch of developed examples, which is one way to develop um, your claim. We give all these examples of, being responsible for correcting doctors' mistakes, being responsible for producing correct documentation, knowing where to find references, transcribing legal documents, claiming responsibility. All those are examples of those new laws regarding medical privacy and responsibility, and all those are great. A great way to develop that idea. So let's look at structure real quick before we move on. So in structure, I couldn't see as I was reading through any clear grammatical errors. I'll probably do a different pass for that, but I didn't catch any on this one. It's kind of a solid paragraph. And as it comes to language and conventions, nothing jumped out, nothing made it hard to read as I was reading it out loud. Again, probably one of the best ways to make sure that your language and conventions are strong is to read out loud to someone or have someone else read your work out loud to you. That second one, having someone else to read your work out loud to you, that's super effective because when they read something that doesn't sound right, you will both be embarrassed and want to immediately fix it. It's me speaking from experience. All right, support paragraph 3, where again we're looking at purpose and focus, idea development, structure, and language and conventions. So let's just go ahead and do a cold read through this and see what we see. Soon, technology again improved. So we're talking about technology's improvement. And the transcriptionists in Marshall's office were sent home with computers to make space in their office for more clinic space. To make space in their office for more clinic space. Space and space. Repeated words, not great, but it's a little thing. A few things happened and the transcriptionists could not have predicted. No longer would they have human interaction. No longer did Marshall drive or dress for work. She states that doctors assumed the transcriptionist no longer existed. They thought the computer was recognizing their speech, and in fact, some programs were doing that. No longer were the transcriptionists invited to office parties, dinners, and meetings. They were silent, invisible, forgotten. Soon, Marshall realized how much she needed her drive to work in the morning, or the stress relief offered by the drive back home. She says that she felt ugly because she worked in pajamas. Oh, there was no need for makeup. Her work buddies were her pet birds. The only time anyone knew the transcriptions existed is if a mistake was made. So we're talking about how technology has improved and the transcriptionists were sent home with computers. So that's the topic of this paragraph, of this support paragraph. So we're all talking about being home with computers. So no human interaction because you're home with computers. I can relate. No longer did they have to go out for work. Also kind of relate. We're at home with computers. We're explaining that. The doctors assumed they no longer existed. We're talking about the effects of them being at home with computers. They thought the computer was recognizing their speech. That's another impact of the computer. They weren't invited to office parties, dinners, and meetings because they were at home. They were silent, invisible, forgotten because they were at home. Soon she realized how much she needed the drive to work because she was at home. So all these sentences tie back into that original sentence at the beginning of this paragraph about how technology made them be at home. So this is a great example of all of these sentences tying back to, these are all supporting what happened because of that first sentence, them being at home. Every single one of these sentences is tied into that truth. Her new work buddies are birds, and the only time people know they exist is if a mistake was made. So those all tie into that OG statement. Transcriptionists in the office were sent home with computers to make space and space. So as for idea development, these are all examples. Every single one of these sentences is an example that they got from their interview. That's solid. That's a lot of development. That's a lot of support. And it reads well too because they're varying the lengths of their sentences. You can see there's some very short sentences in here. There's some longer sentences in here that have multiple parts. They're doing a good job of variation as well. As it comes to language and conventions, the only thing that really jumped out at me was the use of space twice in one sentence. If I'm reading really carefully and you turn in your rough draft and I have some time to actually get back to you and you do repeated words like that, I'll say something to you along the lines of try to use a different word. So instead of saying home with computers to make space in their office for more clinic space, you might have said sent home with computers to make space in their office so the clinic could be expanded. That way, repeated words just kind of take your reader out of the experience of your writing. That's not just true for academic writing, but that's true for fiction writing too. Unless you're like doing repetition on purpose. A good example of doing repetition on purpose would be when she goes down here and she says the no longers. We have multiple no longers. So that's like some, I believe, intentional repetition that does a good job of, kind of giving you an idea of the loss of moving home and no longer working, and I'm doing it too, and no longer working in person. So this is another strong paragraph. This is definitely a 4. Basically across the board, the only thing I would have given the student as feedback was those spaces. All right, we're at the conclusion paragraph. And in this conclusion paragraph, we're again going to look at purpose and focus, idea development, structure, CAT, and language and conventions. So let's take a look. According to Marshall, there are benefits to working in her field. For 32 years, so what are we talking about? We're talking about the benefits of working in the field. For 32 years, she says she's been receiving a paycheck while receiving a medical education, something most people spend many years and so much money on, and now she can do it from home. That was all benefits. However, one thing I learned by interviewing her is there are better parts of the medical field to go into than medical transcription. Not a benefit. Her description of how the transcriptionists became invisible and were not invited to parties or meetings after they started working from home was sad, and there are other parts of the medical field like nursing that are not able to be done from home. A job that can be changed that easily by technology is not a job I want to have. Medical transcribing was a good job when Avis Marshall started, but no longer is today. Fair enough. Okay, so probably we could have worded that opening sentence a little bit differently. This paragraph is more like a 3 than a 4 out of purpose and focus. We're doing a good job of staying focused on the whole overall essay and kind of concluding it and closing things up. But I would probably have said there are benefits and issues to working in the field, because she doesn't just talk about benefits here in this final paragraph. She's talking about the benefits and the negatives. Of course, she's doing that through some really strong idea development, some great examples in here. And again, just reading it out loud, I don't see any structural issues kind of off the bat right now. This is a well-written essay. The language and conventions don't get in the way of the understanding at all. And this is just generally a really good example of an essay. So I hope that wasn't just a whole bunch of colors on your screen. I hope that helps you a little bit in giving you an idea of what we're looking for when we're grading these rubrics, especially for the final draft. When it comes to the rough draft, this is just kind of a how-to of what I'm looking for and how I grade, and kind of like talk you through my thinking while I'm looking at these essays. Again, this week, the only graded assignment is your rough draft, which is due this Sunday. It is 5 paragraphs long. You need to have the intro, the 3 supports, and the conclusion. And there's no other graded assignment than essay number 2, the rough draft this week. Thanks for listening, and I hope you guys have a great week. Again, sorry I can't be there Monday, but again, thanks for listening, and I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please drop them in the assignment on Google Classroom. Bye.